Okay, so we are now going to start. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening as the Ukraine Canadian Congress and our partners in other ethnic communities, especially the Polish Congress, Manitoba branch, as we commemorate the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact, the signing of that pact, otherwise known as Black Ribbon Day. As many of you know, this is an international commemoration that happens every year on the 23rd of August, which is the date of the signing of the pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The consequences of this are something we'll talk about later, but the immediate consequences of the signing of the pact were that in 1939, this gave Hitler the free hand to declare war or invade Poland and set off the events that we now understand as the Second World War. Without this alliance between the two dictatorships, it was pretty clear that the war would not have started in 1939 at least. The consequences of this pact are far-reaching and were immediately evident to everyone with the occupation of Poland, dismemberment of Poland, the eventual invasion of the Soviet Union, the fall of France, etc., etc. And in 1945, with the conclusion of the war, this immediate consequence was that Stalin and Soviet Union were able to occupy all of Eastern Europe and installed through a series of events, communist governments there that lasted until the fall of the Soviet Union. Many people suffered from the consequences of this pact. There were great distributions or movements of populations. People were deported. Obviously, many people were killed by the combination of the Soviet and Nazi regimes. So, some time ago, about 20 years ago, many Eastern European communities in Canada and worldwide got together and installed, or it started this as the day of commemoration called Black Ribbon Day. And again, this is an international commemoration in the European Union and by Canada's Parliament, amongst others. So that's a small introduction to this. We will hear more. Our speakers today are Joan Lewandosky, the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Manitoba Provincial Council, Margaret von Lau, who is the president of the Canadian Polish Congress, Manitoba branch, and Professor Orysia Kulick of the University of Manitoba, who will be speaking on the modern consequences of the pact. So, Joanne, I'd ask you to bring greetings on behalf of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress.
On behalf of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Manitoba Provincial Council, I would firstly like to acknowledge and thank Dr. Orysia Kulick for accepting the invite as our guest speaker this evening. Joining us as well is Margaret von Lau from the Canadian Polish Congress Manitoba branch, with whom we annually share hosting this event. Our technical consultant, Mithral Malik, and our moderator and host for the commemoration, Ostap Skripnik. Thank you all for sharing your knowledge and devoting your time this evening for this event. Once again, we have gathered to acknowledge Black Ribbon Day, an annual day of commemoration of the millions of innocent victims of the Nazi and Soviet tyranny, when we are reminded of the importance of protecting freedom, democracy, and human rights wherever we live. 82 years ago today, on August 23rd, 1939, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and Nazi German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop signed an agreement, officially known as the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, that we have come to identify as the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact. A week after the signing, the Second World War began with the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany. 2 weeks later, Soviet troops also occupied areas of Poland. The victorious campaign ended with a brotherhood parade of Red Army and Wehrmacht units through occupied Brest. How ironic that today Russia purports itself as a liberator and celebrates Victory Day on May 8th as the conqueror over Nazi Germany in the so-called Great Patriotic War. Putin's recent assault on the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine reminds us that imperialism is not yet dead. It has not been conquered, and the cause of liberty and justice continually must be defended. Black Ribbon Day historically commemorates the anniversary of the sinister partnership treaty between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, allowing each to violently and illegally seize the lands situated between them and to destroy the lives of millions of peaceful citizens. In November 2009, Canada's Parliament unanimously passed a resolution to establish an annual Canadian Day of Remembrance for the victims of Nazi and Soviet communist crimes on August 23rd, called Black Ribbon Day, which coincides with the anniversary of the signing of the infamous Molotov Ribbentrop Pact, the two totalitarian regimes. We stand today with people of conscience around the world to remember the millions who were victimized and perished at the hands of the communist and Nazi regimes, and to bring awareness to help ensure that this page in our history is never repeated. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Now I would ask Margaret von Lau, President of the Polish Canadian Congress, Manitoba branch, to say a few words.
Thank you for an invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. We must remember that the Second World War, started by Germany and Russia, caused the death of over 60 million people. Out of this enormous number, 35 millions were murdered by Nazis and communists and not killed because of the military actions. Memory of these events, of people and their tragedies, it's still present. An example of which is adopted by the European Parliament, the Black Ribbon Day in 2008. This day, it has special significance because it was on August 23, 1939, when two countries, Germany and Russia, signed a non-aggression pact. The pact, in fact, which contributed to the outbreak of the World War II. In this special time, Canadian Polish Congress Manitoba District joined the Ukrainian Canadian Congress to honor the memory of all those murdered, starved to death, and deported by the two brutal systems, German Nazism and the Russian communism. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, for those words. I now have a great pleasure to introduce Orysia Kulick, professor at the University of Manitoba in the departments of Slavic Studies and Political Science. This is a bit of we're very pleased because this is sort of an introduction of Orysia to our community. Orysia was hired recently for a tenure track position at the University of Manitoba, which we are very happy to have heard. And unfortunately, last year, because of COVID, as everybody else, we didn't get to see Orysia. Orysia was teaching online, and it was a strange year to start things off. And it's I'm happy to learn that the University of Manitoba is moving towards having more in-person interaction, and we'll be happy to see Orysia at some of our community events, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to visit the university campus to hear lectures and talks that and seminars that she is leading. Orysia has a PhD in history from the Stanford University, and also degrees from the University of Michigan and the Ohio State University. Her research and teaching interests are Russian politics, comparative politics, Soviet and post-Soviet Ukraine, modern European history, empire, women and war, human rights, rebellion and revolution, science and technology, and of course, World War II. All of this will help us with, or will help Orysia be able to speak to the topic at hand. And we're looking very much forward to hearing her presentation. Orysia, you can begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate you inviting me to speak here today. As someone whose own Galician family was swept up in the tumult of the Second World War, I appreciated having the opportunity to reflect on the meaning of the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 and its contemporary consequences. Now, I was asked to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, so this is not a comprehensive history or lecture about the pact itself and its consequences, but I revisit some of the history in order to contextualize what is happening in the region today in our discussion of this pact in this area, in this sphere called memory politics or memory wars, as it sometimes is referred to in the region. And that's a way of describing very different accounts of the past and attempts of governments and individuals and social groups to kind of steer the conversation in particular directions. Now, as some of the speakers have noted, tomorrow marks the 82nd anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression pact signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union on August 23rd of 1939. While it was on the surface primarily that, an agreement in which the two signatories promised not to go to war with one another for 10 years, it also included secret protocols for dividing East Central Europe among them, between them, and in this way forcibly redrawing borders and changing the fates of millions of people living in those territories. And we've heard a little bit from our community representatives about that today. And whatever the circumstances that may have led up to that moment of signing the pact, the consequences of it reverberate to this day, not only in stories passed on to the next generation, but also in the region's acrimonious memory politics, a memory politics in which states and governments have taken on a more active role. As a historian, I teach in the political studies and Slavic studies departments, but I am a historian. My view is that history and memory is something that should not be legislated from above, but that comes through dialogue and conversation and intensive research. And what we are seeing in Russia and Poland and Ukraine today, as well as other countries that were impacted by this moment, we see governments passing legislation and attempting to steer the conversation about this shared past in particular directions. And so in order to understand the sort of parameters of the conversation, I'm going to revisit a little bit of this history first. For those impacted by am I speaking too fast? How is the video? It's fine. Okay. For those impacted by the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact, the war was long, longer than for others, 7 years, which is something that is sometimes forgotten in some pockets of the West, especially in places like my homeland, the United States, which entered the war only after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I use the word homeland because one consequence of the war and the redrawing of European borders is that my own family, like many of yours, found themselves stateless, paperless, without a place to call home at the end of the war, at the end of World War II. Some in my community actively resisted repatriation to Soviet Ukraine, leaping off trains with children in their arms and walking back to the DP camps from which they had been taken. Others would have survived concentration camps. Some had worked as Ostarbeitere, and for the communities gathered here in Winnipeg, these are likely to be familiar stories. But there are others that are also more challenging to acknowledge alongside these stories, such as nationalist collaboration with occupying forces and other difficult passages of this larger history. And the truth of the matter is that the local peoples caught between these two forces, the Wehrmacht on the one side and the Red Army on the other, and these include Poles and Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Latvians, their Jewish neighbors and others, they were killed in very large numbers, sometimes by the occupying armies and their accompanying SS and NKVD police units, and sometimes by each other. And it is this legacy of violence that we also have to think about when we're commemorating this moment of neighbors turning against one another. And this fact lingers in today's history writing and in the memory politics in the region, alongside these overarching questions about what may have propelled the Soviets to sign this non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in the first place. And one of the major questions comes from the fact that the signatories of this pact were ideologically opposed, which raises many questions about how they managed to find a common cause with one another. And in recent times, so this is the sort of contemporary consequence element, the Russian government, for instance, has tried to normalize this pact amid criticism of that decision by suggesting that its signing had been taken out of its appropriate context, the context being Europe's realpolitik of the 1930s. The argument there is that the Soviets had tried and failed to come to an agreement with Britain and France, and was left with little choice but to forestall its involvement in the forthcoming war by signing a non-aggression pact with Germany. Considering this larger context and anti-communism as a force that in a way undermined the idea of collective security in Europe at this time, one can see that perhaps the Russians may have a point here, one that at minimum should be considered as part of our larger conversation of this moment in time. And as a Soviet historian, I also, when I think about this situation, I remember the domestic situation inside the Soviet Union itself. If you remember, the Soviet Union had just carried out a series of purges, arrests, deportations, and executions of enemies of the state in the mid to late 30s. And this capped off a decade that included also forced collectivization, dekulakization, a widespread famine, and the famine genocide we now know as the Holodomor. And so this pact comes at the end of a decade like this for the Soviet Union. And to my mind, given this situation, it would seem plausible that they would try to temporarily avoid entering another kind of war. Now, whether this is sufficient enough of an explanation is certainly a matter of vociferous debate, and there are strong arguments made on both sides. And in particular, whether one can distinguish between the circumstances leading to the signing of the pact from what followed shortly thereafter. And this is a fierce point of contention, especially among East Europeans who felt for themselves the full force of the pact's consequences. In promising not to take any military action against one another and deciding in advance how they would carve up Eastern Europe, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union altered Europe's geopolitical terrain and the contours of the World War to come. As previous speakers have mentioned, German troops invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, almost immediately after signing this agreement. And this, in essence, triggered World War II. Because in response to this German aggression, Great Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany, in part fulfilling their promises to Poland. Meanwhile, the Soviets prepared their own invasion of Eastern Poland, which took place shortly thereafter on September 17th, 1939. And from history and our own family stories, we know what followed. These dueling occupations of East and West, on the east and west of the Molotov Ribbentrop line, shredded the existing social fabric of Eastern Europe, and violently so. West of the Molotov Ribbentrop line, the area controlled by Germany, we saw the establishment of Jewish ghettos, the implementation of humiliating regulations that disenfranchised Polish Jews. We also saw Einsatzgruppen arrest and murder Polish citizens in order to, quote, render the upper levels of society harmless, end quote, as Timothy Snyder has noted in some of his works. In other words, by targeting community leaders for deportation, exile, and sometimes execution, and we're talking here about doctors, lawyers, scientists, professors, politicians, army officers, and so on, the aim ultimately was to destroy Poland as a functioning society and make its citizenry more compliant. In the territories annexed by the Soviet Union, east of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line, we saw another kind of, quote, revolution from abroad, as Jan Gross described it in his book on the subject. In addition to more general Soviet policies of socialization and control, this includes participation in non-competitive elections, inculcation in the classroom, the promotion of indigenous elites and workers, the collectivization of agriculture, and so on, sort of the cornerstones of transformative Soviet policies. We too saw the mass deportation of Poles from the newly annexed regions of Eastern Poland during this time. And this is, we now refer to as Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. Newer estimates suggest that approximately 350,000 Poles were arrested and deported from cities and villages in these territories, exiled to Siberia and beyond. And I wanted to pause for a minute and say, I'm not going to give comprehensive examples. These are just indicative of the kinds of policies we saw to the east and west of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line. But what I found striking is this targeting of elders, the clergy, the politically active, in both east and west, in the territories both to the east and the west of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line, with the intended effect of disorienting local communities and taking sort of diffusing possible sources of opposition to the occupation. This is somewhat bleakly referred to sometimes as a decapitation of society, where you remove those who are wiser from age and experience, who might caution against certain kinds of actions or provide stability in times of tumult. And in both cases, we saw the destabilization of Eastern Europe from above. In some parts of Eastern Europe, this happened more than once as the front moved back and forth. And you can begin to imagine the sort of destabilizing impact and how that would accumulate over the years of the war in communities in this region. I've only given a few examples to gesture toward what life looked like under the occupation of this period, 1939 to 1941. And what life would have been like in these early years of the war. We know that by the end of the war, this region, which had been a mosaic of religious, ethnic, and linguistic difference, did not resemble itself anymore. So we're talking about 1944, 1945. By that point, the Jews of Europe had been annihilated. Poles and Ukrainians had turned against one another again and had to be separated through repatriation and resettlement. European borders had been redrawn and in the immediate post-war period appeared uncertain. And we were left with a tenuous mix of victims and perpetrators who became victims, and vice versa. And these processes happened over a long period of time, a prolonged 7-year period during which the people of this region experienced the brutalization of war continuously. And it's important to pay attention to how policies shift over time over these 7 years. This is important not only to understand how the war unfolded, but how the inhabitants of these territories, Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Jews, and others came to find themselves in conflict with one another. And that agency or lack thereof at the local level is very important for understanding the conditions of possibility of all of those living in these lands. Germany, as we know, would break the non-aggression pact abruptly, less than 2 years later, when its forces invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, in what is known as Operation Barbarossa. Although the Soviet Union was initially overwhelmed by the invasion, it must be said that the Soviets fought valiantly over the next 4 years to drive the German forces back from whence they came, but not before the grimmest Nazi policies were carried out in the Eastern Front. This included, of course, the Holocaust by bullets in the East, a process driven by Nazi ideology, but carried out with the help of locals in part, and the Soviet exploitation of Soviet POWs and other prisoners that were taken as forced laborers, the leveling of cities, the destruction of infrastructure. Victory came at a very steep price in this case for the Soviet Union, who lost around 27 million people during the war, the majority of whom were civilians. The fact that the Soviets played such an important and outsized role in defeating Nazi Germany has meant that the part of the story we're discussing today, the roughly 2 years when the Soviets and Nazis were allied, has been pushed out of larger narratives of Soviet heroism under incredibly daunting odds. And they were daunting. I think we do have to recognize that. The Soviets worked to hold down the Eastern Front and together with the Allies to defeat the Axis powers. And this depiction has become central to Russia's understanding and representation of its role in the war. Challenges to that narrative that come in the form of a critique of the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 and what happened as a consequence of that alliance are not received well in the corridors of power in the Kremlin or in Russia more generally, but it does reflect the lived realities of East Europeans. And here we enter into the realm of today's memory politics in the region, which highlights the legacies of 1939 from a somewhat different perspective. Confronting this past is difficult, any past really, but it becomes particularly difficult when it involves neighbors turning against one another in what the sociologist Jan Gross has referred to as intimate violence. His observations about what happened and also what was lost as a consequence of World War II are particularly poignant, especially today when we think about the long-term consequences of a series of decisions made at the highest echelons of power, sanctioned by the leaders of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, but that were enacted and experienced by everyday people on the ground. Their stories are often lost in these discussions of big decisions of major geopolitical significance, but they are no less important to the conversation. And here I quote briefly from Jan Gross's Revolution from Abroad, where he describes the situation in Eastern Galicia. And the rest of the territories annexed by the Soviet Union. In these easternmost hinterlands of interwar Europe, each hamlet or village was to a large degree an isolated universe. As often happens in such an environment, intense personal hatreds were harbored, and an ethnic and religious component gave them the potential to engulf entire communities. Yet as much as the violence represented an explosion of combined ethnic, religious, and nationalist conflict, I'm nevertheless struck by its intimacy. More often than not, victims and executioners knew each other personally. Even after several years, survivors could still remember their names. Definitely people took this opportunity sometimes to get even for personal injuries in the past, end quote. And what I mean to highlight here by quoting Gross at length is that some of the wartime experiences are felt very personally, not at this macro level that we can sometimes discuss them. And how those events are remembered, memorialized, and discussed can vary greatly depending on one's vantage point. Ukrainians, Poles, Jews, Russians, and others may have gone through the same events, but are not likely to always have experienced them in the same way, either individually or collectively. And when those conflicting interpretations intersect, this is where you see friction and disputes over historical memory. And these disjunctures are what we're confronting today in the region and in its memory politics. Recently, the Second World War and the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 in particular have become central to disputes between Russia and its neighbors, Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, for instance, not only in the realm of memory politics, but in how they relate to one another today. When pressed on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Russian leadership tends to respond defensively, suggesting that false equivalence between the two regimes, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, is a distortion of history, implying that they were more alike than they actually were. And I do agree that we should be more careful in our comparisons of these two very different regimes, because the occupation played out in very different ways under both. Moreover, Russians also tend to counter these kinds of critiques of its wartime record with rejoinders about appeasement of and collaboration with the Nazis by a number of actors at various stages of the war, in that way attempting to regain the moral high ground. And here too are some valid points, particularly the need for East Europeans to view this period not selectively, but in its entirety. Along with victimhood, we must also discuss collaboration as well. And it is in that discomfort and in those uncomfortable conversations that we can move forward together. In such a charged discursive environment, referred to sometimes as European memory wars, it can be at times difficult to have open and honest discussions of wartime histories. This is a discursive environment that privileges defensiveness sometimes, and also rationalizations for past decisions, even those that had myriad negative consequences. This also tends to buffer certain historical actors from critique, which runs counter to what we do as scholars and historians and evaluators of the past. Among the contemporary consequences and challenges in discussing this period of history is the overt politicization of the past that we are seeing throughout Eastern Europe today. We are not seeing dispassionate assessments and discussions of the past in which we try to understand what happened to the best of our knowledge based on the information in front of us. We are seeing highly charged conversations, sometimes with political overtones and certain outcomes in mind, and particularly disconcerting our efforts at the state level to control the narrative around the Second World War, articulating what can and cannot be discussed. Sometimes this goes as far as to passing legislation that forbids discussion of certain topics in certain ways. We have seen this in Ukraine with its decommunization laws, and we have seen this in Poland, where historians are defending their work and themselves in courtrooms after being accused of defamation. In both instances, the critiques pertained toward discussion of collaboration. In both on academic freedom, because it is at its core just that. And supporters of these measures, like the decommunization laws, argue that there are already many biases embedded in the historiography on Ukraine and Poland, in the existing scholarship on the region and this moment in time. Still, I would posit that government interference in the writing of history is never desirable. Confronting the past is hard work, and the difficulties we have in discussing this period demonstrate that the legacies of 1939 are still very much with us. Unfortunately, memory politics or these memory wars have overtaken efforts at reconciliation in the region, which was always going to be a long and painstaking process. If we remind ourselves, however, that the writing of history is comprised of arguments, hypotheses, and ideas about the past that are backed up as much as possible with good documentation that come from different angles and take into account the experiences of all different individuals involved. If we remind ourselves of that, then I think it becomes easier to dial down the intensity of these debates over history, over memory, and find a common ground for discussion. I thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts on the contemporary legacies of the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 on the eve of tomorrow's anniversary. I welcome any questions or comments you may have, but for now, we'll pass the platform back to our moderator, Mr. Skripnik, who seems to have disappeared.
I'm sorry for the little technical problem. Thank you very much, Orysia, for your presentation. We have again. I hope that I'm being heard. Okay, thank you. We have one question from the public, which I'd like to thank, and this is Black Ribbon Day recognized in Ukraine nowadays or in Russia? What about Belarus?
I confess to not knowing the answer to that question. I'm unsure.
Okay. Orysia, I didn't hear that. I didn't hear the response, but I hope that again, we're sorry for this at the end of this thing that we have this problem. As much as I understand, it's not recognized. It's not marked in Ukraine per se, and in Russia, the answer to the question was obvious from Orysia's discussion. It's not viewed as a black day that needs to be commemorated. The interpretation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is different from what the European Union, European Parliament understood it to be. Belarus, of course, the Second World War being the, say, national founding myth of post-Soviet Belarus, also is, I would suppose, along the same lines as that of the Russian Federation. On that, I'd like to bring our evening to a conclusion. I'd like to thank Margaret and Joan for their participation, and especially I'd like to thank Dr. Kulick for an extremely interesting and far-reaching discussion on this very interesting topic, with a lot of things that we wouldn't normally hear at a community event. This was, I think, the analysis was very interesting. I'd like to remind everyone, if they'd want to hear it again, that this presentation will be on our YouTube channel for the foreseeable future, and a link will be sent out to different organizations to be able to share internally. So once again, thank you very much. We commemorate, remember the events of 1939. Many of us, as Orysia mentioned, are actually in Canada or North America because of the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact and the consequences of the war. And many of us remember, you know, from hearing from our relatives about how, you know, August 19th and September 1939 looked. People remember exactly the arrival of the Soviets in mid-September. And again, the entire many of our lives are formulated around the events. So thank you once again for participating. I'll just say that tomorrow there's a mass at maybe Margaret can tell us the information.
And we have a mass in the Polish church, in the Andrew Boboli church. And we are inviting everyone to come. And we are also, I would like to take opportunity to thanks for the invitation, and also the professor, and your presentation was very meaningful for all of us, especially the part that we have to leave our countries. And if we wouldn't have the Second World War, we probably would be born our children in their own countries. And now it's having this situation that we are having two countries, and we belong to the both of countries. Our heart, it's still in our country of our families and our parents. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Yeah. Again, thank you to everyone who participated, and all the best. And we apologize for the little technical glitch at the end of the presentation. Hopefully you'll forgive us for this. Okay? На добраніч, на все добре, до відзення.